I've been having a lot of fun lately doing backside ollies. Yesterday I was doing a bunch, and it is a trick that I've been doing for a long time. So in this video we're going to go over kind of like a masterclass of how to do backside ollies. I made this format before. It's basically kind of like an in-depth how to ski transition tutorial specifically on one trick. This one's going to be the backside ollie. I've been wanting to learn body HRs. That's a trick I don't know how to do, which is basically a backside air and then you slap your tail down. That is a trick I want to do. So I've been doing a lot of backside ollies. It's been really fun. So I figured why not jump into a full sort of tutorial on it. We're here at the MLK skate park in Oceanside. Let's jump into it. Ollies on transition, backside. Basically I had to stop filming yesterday because someone pulled up in the parking lot and they're playing such loud music that there was no way you would have been able to hear my dialogue of me explaining how to do the backside ollie. So first thing that I think is important is just getting board control, and the one thing that I think is really going to help with that is just finding a crack or something to kind of bonk off inside of the skate park or outside of the skate park. Now this isn't going to be the first thing to get into backside ollies, however I think it is going to help in the future of your backside ollie. So it is a good thing to kind of get acclimated to in the very beginning. I always say this, but experience is your best teacher. One thing that I think this is really going to help you with is just getting that experience and getting that board feel. So this is kind of the crack I'm going to use. For example, it's not super big, but we can bonk off it. It's got enough where if you hit it enough, you're going to feel it, and that's all we need. We don't need anything super big. So the idea here is just to figure out your feeding positions, because I can sit here and tell you exactly where my feet go, but I think it really does vary on you. How big your feet are, how big your board is, all that has to do with that. So the point of this is just to kind of lift up right before the crack. You're kind of doing a little bit of a manual. It's not going to feel like much of a manual because it's so short. You just want to lift up right before that crack. And the idea here is to bonk your back wheels. And what you want to do with this is kind of just lightly lift your back feet, kind of just lift it off so that you can figure out that motion. And the idea with this ultimately is just to figure out how your feet sort of control that board when you're bonking off a crack. I know that seems really simple, really easy, but I really do think it's going to get you comfortable with just that board motion, that board control before you start churning into like a 90 or 180 degrees. So basically with this, it's just handling a little bit, just lifting up. So you just want to have your foot in that back spot wherever you feel most comfortable. That's the idea. Typically, it's going to be about right here. You kind of want it in your normal riding position. It's not much of an ollie. You're not going way back on your tail. You're kind of just staying right here in that sort of concave in between your tail and the flat part of your board. With your front foot, again, it's kind of wherever it's comfortable, but the idea is you want to lift up a little bit and just get used to that motion. And the motion of kind of bring your board back up to your feet. So it's going to lift, you're going to get a little bit of bonk, and you just want to keep your feet right in good position to land. That's just going to get you acclimated with things before you start turning 90 or 180 degrees. As much as I don't want to tell you where you should put your feet when you're doing this, here's kind of how I have mine. I have my toe barely hanging over the front, and I want more heel over here. I don't want it to be like this or sideways, kind of like you do when you're olling. You almost want your like foot a little bit sideways so you get that flick. For me, it's more about turning it kind of more flat. Actually, that front foot a little more flat, and then you want that back foot right in that pocket spot, right about there. It's almost hard to ollie on flat like that, but it's going to work a lot when you start bonking. That's it, nothing big. Now before we actually start catching air, I think it is good to get comfortable with just some backside kick turns, nose grabs. I'm a big advocate for that. I just think this is one of those techniques that's really going to help in the future of just figuring out that motion of turning your shoulder. So grabbing it is also going to get you used to that shoulder motion. The first thing for backside ollies on transition, I actually think it's just about learning how to ollie on transition. So you don't need to like go right into a 90 or 180 degrees right away. What I would use is actually a hip that I'm going to show you in a second, where you can kind of just actually go forward. So as long as you can ollie on flat, that's the only thing you really need to know how to do is ollie on flat and kick turn. You can kind of go forward just to get used to that tail snapping on the transition, because that is a lot different on transition or a bank than it is on flat. I think a hip like this is going to be really good for just getting your first ollies on transition. So before you're rotating too much, you kind of just want to figure out that motion of ollieing on transition. This is nice and round, so it's not too steep. There's not a right point to pop, and I think that's really important. There's no popping point on this really round hip, and I think that's a good thing. It might be challenging, but the point here is that you're not ollieing at the top. You're actually going to start ollieing personally, if I were you and learning this trick, I would ollie really low, kind of down here, and just get little snaps. And the point here is just to go forward. So it's kind of like a flat ground ollie, but the difference is that you're getting used of the transition, because the reality of transition is when you're going up, there's a lot more to go down to hit your tail, or in flat, you're a lot quicker to it. So I think when you're in transition, it's gonna feel a little weird. You're gonna have a little bit of that invisible pop at first. So what you really need to figure out with this is just about figuring out where that pop spot is, where your back foot needs to go so you can hit that tail. You don't need to smack the tail too hard. The idea here is just to figure out how to get your board off the ground and going forward while you're not worried about turning your shoulders or anything like that, because that can get more difficult. It might be challenging because you're not sure like where to do it, but you can even make markers, you can tape it down, use chalk, whatever you need to do, and kind of just like vision that you're olling forward versus olling over hip or olling at a corner at all. Now for some people, really sharp hip might work better because they need to have a target. And when you have a target, sometimes it's easier to vision where you're going. So if a round hip isn't working for you, you don't have to stick to that. And that's something I always try to say in my videos. This is just how I do things. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do skateboard tricks. Sometimes a sharp hip, sometimes a round hip, it's whatever works best for you. Something like this does have more of an ending and starting point. So sometimes that's better for people. You can kind of snap off the end, but the thing is, you're never really snapping right on that edge. You're snapping much before it, and you kind of want to hover over that edge and get onto the front of it. So the point here is just to get over your board and get in front of it so that you're not worried about it catching back up with you. You kind of want to keep that board right over the top of you, keeping your head centered, your shoulders straight, not worrying about turning at all, and just getting used to that motion of snapping off that bank or round area and going forward is so crucial to the beginning steps of backside ollie. So I want to ollie right here and just go forward. That's the point. I'm not trying to turn my shoulders. I'm not trying to do anything fancy or stylish right away. I'm literally just doing my flat ground ollie like I normally do, like that. Not big, nothing, just snapping the tail and going forward. Not even really trying to level it out or anything like that. It's just quick little ollie. Now the one thing I will say with transition ollies, especially backside versus a regular flat ground ollie, you do want to have that front foot a little more over. Your toes are a little more over the board to the right. Once you start getting onto that transition, you kind of want to have your toes over, kind of crossing your position almost. Have your back foot right in that pocket place. So the idea here is that your heel is almost balancing your board out. I'll show you a couple examples of how this works essentially so that you can see it in real time. I'll slow it down because sometimes when I'm explaining this stuff, it's not always exactly as it seems. So I think slowing down some of these clips hopefully can show you where my feet are and just kind of the motion of getting over this hip. Again, it's not about turning right now. We're just getting used to snapping our tail on that transition because it's a little bit different than flat. Now, when you're in this stage of learning the backside ollie, I think one of the most important things is just figuring out how to push your chest forward and your whole body forward. So when you're ollieing over that, you're kind of stiffing that shoulder almost because you just want to go straight at this point. You're not worried about turning the shoulder or anything like that. But the one thing that you want to do is try to snap your board and bring it with you. So a little bit of that is kind of just doing this motion with your hips. I know it seems really silly, but the idea is that you want your board to come with you. Let me try a couple more so you kind of see what I'm talking about. So if you see, a lot of that is also in my hips. I'm kind of pulling back and then pulling forward. And then when I land, I'm trying to be more forward than I am back. So when you're coming up, you're carrying the back seat, and then as you ollie over the hip, you're going forward, and then you kind of want to stand back to center as you roll down the bank. But it is a lot about this motion from going back to forward. I know that's just like a flat ground ollie, but it is really important because you kind of catapult yourself over the hip. All right, so once you're comfortable snapping some of those ollies over kind of more, flat round hip or a sharp hip, if that's what's good for you. The idea there is you want to do it on a bank versus something that's transitioned like this. Because once you start getting to transition, it is a little bit different. There's a lot more involving with your body weight, where it's distributed, where your shoulders are, where your arms are, your hips, everything has a lot to do with it. So once you're comfortable with those hip ollies and just kind of snapping over, the next thing I would say is actually getting into some transition hips. I think it's really good because you don't have to worry about the ollie. I know it's kind of counterproductive what we were talking about a second ago, but I think it's really figuring out that motion. And a good thing about a hip, again, with something like this, is that you can just go forward. I've talked about that in multiple videos with skating bowls and transition, that you actually don't have to ollie. It's kind of like a cheat code. Think of it as like a sideways launch ramp on the transition. So you're just riding sideways and there's a little launch ramp, kind of gets you up and over. So the one thing here that's really going to be a discipline that you're going to learn is how you keep those shoulders in and how you stay into the transition versus actually having to try to pop up. Now this is when that discipline of like backside kick turns and hitting that little crack or bonks like I was talking about in the beginning is really going to come into play with this, because you're not ollieing anymore. We're just kind of getting used to the motion of the hip. So it's basically a backside kick turn, but you're just going forward. And I think getting acclimated to this and just doing it over and over and over is going to be really helpful for the future of your backside ollie. So with this one, there's really not much to it. I'd say it's even easier than the ollieing over a round hip or a sharp hip. Essentially, you just want to do is lift up just like we were doing on the crack and turn your shoulders forward. That's the only difference, is you kind of want to have those shoulders a little more dropped so that you're going into the transition and you're not really just going forward. You're kind of turning ever so slightly, but it really depends on the hip. This one's on a super sharp hip. It's nice and mellow, so I can just push myself forward and get a little bit of air just so I can get used to that motion. We can even go down low. You can start really low and work yourself up. That's what's really nice with the obstacle like this, is you don't have to turn right away or anything like that. So we can start right here and kind of inch our way up, and then as you see it gets higher, there's a little more of a predominant sharp edge. And once we get to this point, we'll get into the next step, because that does change things a little bit. Just a reminder, we're not worried about going really high or anything like that. It's just getting up and over this hip and going forward right here. You're not really worrying about ollieing right now. This is just really going to get you acclimated with just the motion, familiar sort of territory. And if you backside kick turn, you hit those bumps, you can already do this. This is really easy. We're just going to go straight over and kind of bend our whole body. Remember, we got to stay compressed when we're on transition, so otherwise we'll just zing out. We're not going to do anything. So as we're going up, we're pumping, we're absorbing, we're pushing off the top, and then we're absorbing as we ride down. So I'm not sure if you can notice right there, but I'm not even moving my feet at all. I'm pretty much keeping them as is. The one thing that I did notice just now is like really absorbing it. So when I was going off, I was almost trying to tuck in a little bit more because I could get more air that way, and the impact is not going to be as hard and kind of pump out of it. So at this stage, it's a lot about just getting acclimated with going over that hip and just getting comfortable with it. You want to slowly start dropping that front shoulder down, and you're going to slowly start kicking that back foot up. That's the motion. So you're kind of doing this motion over time. You're not really going to ollie yet. This is just getting comfortable. You want to get repetitive with it. The next step we're going to do is the actual backside ollie on a flat wall. This has all been sort of like a precursor to that point, essentially. Not enough ramp right there. So that's one thing you want to make sure, is that whatever you're skating has a long, wide area for learning backside ollies, because you're not going to be scooping straight up and straight down like Jimmy Wilkins or Kevin Staub right away. You want to have a nice, long, drawn out area even after you get used to that ollieing forward, because that's going to get you more acclimated just with turning. Over time, you can get more sharp. All right, so now you want to forget everything that I already taught you. We're going to change it all. No, I'm just kidding. It all sort of blends into each other. I know some of these might sound counterproductive to what I'm saying, but it is about a cross blend of everything. So having a nice long wall like this is going to be really good for getting your first backside ollies on a flat wall, essentially. Then we're going to get into some like bigger coping, some bigger walls, but having a nice long wall is really important for learning your first backside ollies. Now, the reason we want this long flat wall is because we're going to go up the side. We're not going to go straight up. The reason I keep getting low is because that guy is over there playing really loud music. You won't be able to hear me otherwise. So the idea here is that not that we're going straight up and we're ollieing and we're turning down. That's something that's going to take a lot of skill and time. The idea here is you really want to draw it out. So when I say draw it out, what I mean is you want to come sideways and then ollie. Go that way. The idea here is it's less turn, so it's less strenuous on your shoulders, your foot position, your hips, everything. It's going to have a lot more simplicity to it, essentially. So once you figure out that snap motion, which we figured out on the hips, we figured out the hip motion of our shoulders, where those go. Right here, it's just going to be about pushing yourself forward and having that foot over your board and having your feet in that nice solid lock position. And if your feet lose contact with the board, that's totally fine. It happens to me all the time. Just correct yourself, and that's part of the learning process of learning how to backside on a flat wall. So I'll show you a couple examples. I'm gonna do it really drawn out, and then I'm gonna start bringing it in tighter. See, I'm not worried about going too high right now. Just little snaps like that. Just gotta get used to that motion. Just going long. Draw that shoulder out. Oh, sometimes what I do is point where I'm going. So like you can literally do that sometimes is when you're olling, a lot of times I do it naturally. I ended up pointing. My front arm is kind of guiding me to where I'll go. So now what I'm going to try to do is go more straight up and down. And what this is going to take is more of a dip in those front shoulders, and I want to turn my hip down. And when I'm turning my hip down, the idea is I'm getting my back turned. So my whole body's turning up, and I'm able to get more straight down the transition. This is going to happen over some time, but I'll show you some gradual progression with this. I'm going to try to eventually go straight up and down. It's not something I have on lock. It's a really hard trick to go straight up and down on the backside ollie with something this small. Once you get to bigger transition, it is actually a lot easier to go straight up and down, but I'll show you a few examples of just dropping that shoulder, kicking that back foot up, and then moving those hips. You know, it's a bowling motion, bowling, you know, but then also you're pointing where you're going. So let's combine all that together. Whoa. And that's the scary thing about learning backside ollies is like a lot of times you lose your shoulders, you lose your momentum, you don't pop high. There is a safety check with this trick, and I want to explain that really quick because I'll probably show you some examples where you kind of ollie and you can almost stop, like in the middle of your ollie, not turn all the way around, power slide into your backside kick turn. It's a safety way out. I've made a whole video about power slides and why power slides are super beneficial for many reasons. The technique here that I'm explaining is like you kind of stomp it down and then turn. If you can't get that full rotation, it's just a safe way out versus trying to zing or save your board or trying to like fix it too much. Just stomp down, you can slide it onto your butt, or sometimes you just power slide right out of it. Those shoulders snapping, you're turning just like that. So it really is a backside ollie. You're just using all that technique before. Turn it, work your way up like that. Whew. So at this point, it's not about going off the coping, anything like that. It's just getting acclimated with that turn. As you see, the more I start dropping that front shoulder, the more that it's going straight up and down. So I think that's super beneficial. Something that happens over time. You're going to get used to distributing your balance on your board essentially. So dropping that shoulder, like I keep mentioning, pointing and popping early. That is the one technique backside ollies all together. Always pop early. All right, it's getting hot out here. Let's get into some bigger transition with backside ollies. This is when things start to change a little bit, and you're not too worried about snapping off the transition, because once you get to vertical motions up here, like this is almost vert right here, you don't really need to snap the tail, because if you lift up, you're already going to get off the transition, because that's just how gravity works, right? So like if you get to here and you're lifting up, chances are your board's just going to fall up. So I think that's something important. But if you're not comfortable with that motion yet, which is going to take some time, you could snap it earlier. And that's the cool part about big transition backside ollies. When you're learning it, you could snap it really low and you could actually bring it up higher. I think it's a really good technique for just getting comfortable with your board. So you can even snap here. You have more room to ollie up. So there's no hang up factor, and you're kind of scooping up onto the transition essentially. Now, the next little tip of advice is kind of a silly one, but it's something that somebody said to me and it really resonated and it changed everything. Actually, I'll say it didn't really resonate when they said it, but then when I started doing it, it really started to resonate. And what that is, it's doing nothing. And I know it sounds really counterproductive, but you literally do nothing. And you kind of have to freeze when you're doing backside ollies. And it's really foreign to the human body, like to just kind of try to stop in motion, but that's really what it is, especially when you start getting higher and you're bonking off the coping. We'll talk about bonking off the coping in a second, but it is a tip that really did help me. Is like, you kind of want to do less with this trick. There's not too much involved with it, and doing nothing kind of allows your body to float. And it sounds really foreign, but if you just try a few, you might see why that actually is a really good advice. Now, one thing you'll start to notice as you're doing the backside ollies, as the higher you get up onto the transition, you have some more time in the air. So one thing that I noticed what I was doing just now when I was trying to go to the bigger transition is that when I was olling, I actually had time to kind of bring my back up a little bit. So when I'm olling, what I mean by that is I felt like my tail was olling higher than my nose, and I was able to kind of balance that out and point it down. I know it sounds kind of weird. It's one of those things where I think saying it out loud sounds kind of weird, but like if you watch those backside ollies that I was just doing a little bit higher, I was able to pop it up, get enough pop to where I could turn it down, and the back was actually higher. So what I think really has helped is kind of keeping the nose down. I think that's the point that I'm getting at, is when you're olling, you almost want to keep your front nose down and bring the backside up so that it kind of turns with you in that radius. I think that's the one thing that I really noticed as I was doing it. So I was like backside olling, and I was kind of like churning just to get that rotation, but as I was turning, kind of dipping that front shoulder down, I noticed the back was getting higher and kind of counterbalancing it, and I think that really helped to rotate it on the transition. Now I want to kind of wrap up this basic backside ollie sort of tutorial lesson with just the coping bonk. So once you start getting high enough to where you can bonk off that coping backside, I think everything that we talked about is going to be really useful. The only difference here is that one tip that I said earlier, doing nothing and doing less is more with bonking off the coping. So you really don't want to hit that tail. You kind of just want to bonk off that coping like we did in the crack in the very beginning. Remember how we were bonking off that crack in the very beginning of this video? I think that's honestly exactly what the backside ollie off the coping is you're bonking off that crack. Only difference is that you're turning your shoulders and you're kick turning. So doing nothing, it sounds really crazy, but that's really going to help when you're just bonking off that coping, because you don't want to press on your tail too much. You don't need to get inverted at that point. If you're bonking off coping, chances are the transition is steep enough for you to kind of catapult off. So it's going to send you off. You're not really going to hang up. I mean, there's a chance you're going to hang up, but the point is you want to lift off that coping and let that churn and bonk you versus having to ollie where you're olling low and you're going up high. It's sort of a safe way to do it. Now at this point, you're kind of trusting the coping will lift you up and then you want to churn. With this one, I think it's always better to like practice on something that's really steep. That way you don't have to worry about hanging up, or hanging up is a factor, but something that's really steep is going to shoot you out more than something that's really mellow.